El doctor Guimarães tiene maestría en medicina.
Reinaldo Guimarães has its master degree on social medicine since 1985. He was deputy head of Fiocruz, head of science and technology of Brazilian health minister, currently is deputy minister of Biotechnology and Fine.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu vou falar naturalmente em português, aqueles que
Good morning, everyone. I'll speak in Portuguese, so those who do not understand the language, I would like to ask you to please use your headsets, your translation.
Bom, eu vou... A minha fala vai ser pouco diferente da excelente fala eu acredito que os aspectos mais técnicos e de pequena conjuntura sobre o Brasil, nós temos aqui a presença
in Brazil, and by the way, we have the presence of Flavia here, that probably this afternoon and tomorrow we'll have a big opportunity to touch upon those topics. So I will then, my speech will have a more general aspect. I intend to speak about a technological reason approach, which is something that the whole world goes through nowadays, and more particularly the developing countries that are really immersed in this. So at the end, Alicia's speech showed clearly that the political stability is a critical variable in the dynamics, in the metabolism of the thing of technological assessment, as well as incorporation of technology. And this is a problem that when we compare Canada to South America, which is our focus, is a reality that is completely different. When she says that for the last 40 years, Ines has changed twice or three times its general director, that is something that doesn't happen in any of the countries in South America. Therefore, I want to speak from a wider point of view. And secondly, the first contact made with me to participate of this encounter was Flavia, then Monica Soto. And it's very clear to me that the word disruption in supply was told to me. So much more than assessing the technological assessment per se, I will talk about supply disruption, which, by the way, is a problem that we didn't have very frequently in the South American countries, but is beginning to be very frequent, at least in Brazil. We've been going through some disruption of medication supply, more specifically, that are... I'd like to start with this statement, with this quote from Go Brundtland. That was a magnificent general director of the WHO. And nowadays, when we think about WHO, I at least miss a lot the time when she was the director. And what she says here is the baseline of technological assessment in health when you think about incorporation. So if services are to be provided for all, not all services can be provided. So this aspect, let's say, economic in one way, but at the same time, an aspect that also is related to people's health and people's security and safety. seems to me as essential when we discuss assessment and incorporation when it comes to technology. I will then, in the following 30 minutes, approach 4 issues. First of all, I will approach 2 preliminary issues. Then I will debate 3 other general issues. Then I will talk about disruption in supply and incorporation of technologies. And I'll finalize with some political approaches to prevent or to face supply disruption. So the preliminary issues are the following. One thing is when you talk about medications that are on the market, something else is the access to those medications that are available on the market. When we are talking about a country that has a national health system that is universal and public, these 2 things, being on the market and having access to what exists in the market, they sort of overlap. But in none of our countries, even in Brazil, that has a health system that is indeed universal and public, these 2 things actually overlap. They are really far away from each other. So we do have a set of products that are on the market, but it does not mean that the access to those products from those who need it is guaranteed. And the second preliminary issue is the relationship between technique and politics and the incorporation and the assessment of technologies. So when the Ministry of Health in Brazil very recently, about 10 years ago, thought about a first assessment system for assessing technologies to be incorporated, the politicians back then and the directors back then said that those who assess do not incorporate and those who incorporate do not assess. So this is a maxim that in Dr. Alicia's speech became very clear, the independence criterion, which is absolutely fundamental. So the technological assessment has a very important technical component in terms of efficacy, cost-benefit ratio, whereas incorporation is a political decision, definitely political. So what varies is how much technical aspects, how many technical aspects are incorporated in the political decisions. So the more technical aspects in the political decisions, better will be the result, in my way of understanding it. But we need to understand that we are talking about 2 different things, 2 different concepts.
Bem, 3 questões gerais. Primeiro,
now 3 general issues. First of all, nowadays, in the whole world, technology incorporation is key to any health policies. 80 years ago, that was not the same. That was something completely separated. Nowadays, even in the developed country as well as in developed countries or in the emerging countries, this is in the center of the political decisions in the realm of health of all the countries. And the essential reason for that to happen is somehow expressed in this slide that you might not be able to see so well. This is the pharmaceuticals market, globally speaking. So this market, you can see in the bottom right of the slide, you have the expectations for 2017. So it'll be about 1.2 trillion USD. So this is a growth, a sustained growth. So it's not just something that is happening at a specific or isolated moment. So I'm not talking about only medications, but technologies in general. In other words, it's a growth that is extremely intense when it comes to technologies available for health launched in the market, and that is what makes the technological assessment having moved to the center of the political decisions in the realm of health in the whole world. So this is not a phenomenon that is new. I'm sorry, it is actually very new, that was established throughout the last 15 or 20 years. And of course that there were some similar things before, but the concept of the assessment in health was born in Great Britain, in the UK, since the 50s, and it was born, and it's important to say that it was born in the soul of the national health system of the UK. It was not born back then due to an economic reason. It was born the reason was to protect the users of that technology. So there's a great researcher, British researcher, Dr. Cochrane, that actually originated this type of initiative that is now global, which was called the Cochrane Initiative, that addressed this topic very much. So it's an essential problem. The essential problem when they first began doing it was not the money spent with technology, but the safety and the efficacy of the therapy and the patients. So this is also, how can I say it, some sort of important conceptual separation that we have to pay attention to. What's new about this movement, this detachment, is actually put in this slide. So we will see that in Sweden, in Great Britain, in Germany, in France, in Canada, everything happened as of the 80s, okay, from the last century until now. So it's a quite recent phenomenon, but that means that we are all learning. Dr. Alicia's intervention shows that it's a permanent learning sophistication process where political stability is crucial, and I want to emphasize that a lot. The third issue is related to what I call the technological imperative. So when I say that my intervention here will address a criticism or a great context of a technological reason, that is due to the idea or the hypothesis that we live nowadays in the health systems a technological imperative, and I will explain what I mean by that. So this terminology, technological imperative, was used for the first time by this sir you can see here, which is a great guy, Victor Fuchs. He's American. He was a professor at Stanford, and he wrote a book, The Health Economy. That is a very important book, a classic book, that for the first time you can see this technological imperative terminology being used. And it was used again by the set of researchers that developed the concept of national systems of innovation, both in Great Britain as well as in the US. And that is a work that is fundamental when it comes to what we are trying to address here, that use this technological imperative again, as I've said before. So I will tell you what I think it means, but before I do that, I would like to say what it is not, what technological imperative is not. In other words, the criticism to the technological reason is not related neither to, let's say, the proposals of the UK residents of the end of the 19th century that thought that the guilt should lie upon the machines and they would break them. So of course we know I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the technological imperative, and it's also not what Ivan Illich, I don't know if you've heard about him, who also died. He used to study theology in Austria. So in 1960 he wrote a book called The Medical Nemesis. And what did he say? He said that modern medicine is against health. He was against health systems, which is also not what I want to talk about when we talk about the technological imperative. Now I will say what I do think it means. So the technological imperative is related to the following. After the Second World War, in fact, specific actions when it comes to healthcare have had some real impact in the dynamics of morbidity and mortality in populations. Indeed, only after the end of the Second World War, mortality had been decreasing since the end of the 18th century in Europe as well as in the US, and we have stats to show that. However, the efficacy of actions focused directly to health, to fighting diseases, only happened in an important way after the Second World War. And right after the Second World War, we also saw the national health systems being born. So we have, as of that moment, those three great oval parts in the graph that are in order of determination. So the arrival of the social welfare, the creation of the national health systems, and the health technologies. So, and I put one around the other as an element of subordination. So the technologies are subordinated to the national health systems, and the national health systems are subordinated to the welfare, social welfare. What happens nowadays? Well, nowadays we have some criticism and, to a certain extent, a failure of the state social welfare. When Alicia says that in Canada, which is one of the examples of a state social welfare in the world, when she says that nowadays the health system suffers ever greater pressures from the private sector over the public sector, which happens in Brazil as well. And what happens with all national systems is, if you think about the NHS in Great Britain, what happens is that the state social welfare is under attack. And effectively, actually, the national health systems that were created to think about the state welfare are also under attack. On the other hand, that happens at a moment where the technological dynamics in the health realm is something that grows, as I showed you, in the pharmaceutical market, as an example. So this inversion of determinations and, let's say, quote, causalities, end of quote, exposes this issue. So nowadays, ever more, the national health systems are administrated by or guided by the health technologies. And what I show here is like the tail wagging the dog. And that is the technological imperative, and that takes place in all the countries of the world. Well, the construction of this technological imperative is something that takes place due to many reasons, and I selected these 5. First of all, due to the introduction of new technologies or modified technologies. The most important example, Alicia also mentioned in her intervention, are the diagnosis based on image. That between the 60s and the 90s, we had the launch of 3 technologies that one did not surpass the other. That is something really interesting. It's something particular to the health technology. It not only does not make cost
costs go down as they advance, which happens in other technological realms, such as computers, for example. A computer, when it was launched, used to cost many thousands of dollars, and now it costs $100.
That's not the case with health technology. CT scan, for instance, MRI, and PET scan. Over the course of 25 years, they were launched, and they compete against each other, and the more advanced the technology, the greater the stimulus for it to be used. The second thing is an increase in the intensity and the use of existing technologies. A very clear example, which is almost epidemic in Brazil, is the use of a medication called Ritalina. I believe in most of the countries you know what it is. There's a recent study by a Brazilian researcher showing that in the last decade, the consumption of Ritalina in Brazil increased by 850%. And this has to do with the development of a specific diagnosis called TDAH, which is something related to hyperactivity. The third is the expansion and the application of new technologies, which is simply what we call the off-label use, which is the use of a technology for something that's not in the label of the drug. And that afterwards it's incorporated in the rest of the label as the sanitary records do so. An example of that is Botox. Botulinum toxin, which started to be used 1 decade or 2 decades ago for very precise indications and is currently used for almost everything. Dentists use Botox, gynecologists use Botox for certain procedures and so forth. Fourth, and this seems to be very important to me, is the fact that technologies became indicators or markers of quality. And in a certain way, a decision as to why to incorporate a technology or not the incorporation of a technology into a hospital or a health institution does not obey relevant therapeutic or diagnostic aspects, but rather some marketing guidelines. If you look at the advertisements in hospitals and health institutions, for instance, having a technology is the criterion that intends to provide quality to what the institution offers. And finally, specialization, subspecialization processes for health professionals, especially physicians. Specialization in the medical sector is something that dates back to the 19th century. However, in the last decades, this specialization and subspecialization started having a much more intense dynamics, which stems from mastering a certain technology. Currently, a very important part of young physicians that graduate is that they're specialists in a certain procedure, or actually the use of a certain machine or a certain piece of equipment, which determines their entire professional lives. So these 5 aspects establish what we call the construction of the technological imperative, so to speak. And what's its impact? there are several impacts. There's an impact related to patient safety, and many technologies increasingly more sophisticated that incorporate aspects that are increasingly more risky. And this impact, at least it's the impact that politicians understand, which is the huge increase in the costs of medical care. The red line represents the US, and this graph is outdated. Health in the US is responsible for around 25% of their GDP. 25%, that means 1/4 of everything that's produced by the United States goes to health. And most of this enormous increase is due to the introduction of health technologies.
Desabastecimento e incorporação de tecnologias, né? E aí eu quero dizer que
withdrawal and incorporation of technologies, and I want to point out to something that's typically Brazilian, and I believe that it also exists in other neighboring countries. Mistaken policies for the incorporation of new technologies may lead to lack of supply. In Brazil, the most important policy that represents a mistaken incorporation is what we call the legalization of medical product supplies, which is lawyers, doctors, and judges that mandate the state to provide a certain medicine that's not formally incorporated into their lists. And in Brazil, this piece of information is from 2013, and we have an organization in Brazil that's similar to that of Canada, and that the 3 levels of government, federal, states, and municipalities have their own obligations. So the Ministry of Health alone in 2013 spent $130 million supplying products and services required through lawsuits. And in Brazil as a whole, the estimate, if we added all the states and the municipal secretariats of health, this achieved $450 million. I believe Flavia will tell you about that, but what's curious about the situation is that at the beginning of 2011, out of coincidence, it was the same year that Canada did it, Brazil implemented a law that defines the concept of integrality, which is one of the concepts that constitute the Brazilian health system, which is what would be supplying fully to the health sector, and that's provided for by law. However, judges ignore that law because they say that in Brazil's constitution there is an attachment saying that health is a duty, an obligation of the state, and a right of our citizens. This is an example of what I call a radical deformation in the process of the incorporation of technologies. Another important aspect related to this is what we call the ways of the big pharma. You can ask me, what's a big pharma? Well, the big pharma is something that appeared between these two quotes. The first one is by the son of Merck's founder, and that's what he used to say in 1952. We try never to forget that medicine is for the people, It's not for the profits. And he was the president, the CEO of a large pharmaceutical company. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. At the bottom, you see a sentence by Bayer's CEO from 2014, and he says that we did not develop this medicine for Indians. We developed it for Western patients who can afford it. Between 1952 and 2014, this entity called Big Pharma, which gathers together the biggest pharmaceutical companies of the world, basically located in the US, but also in the UK and some of them in Switzerland, these three countries that where they are located, they became the biggest driver for the launch of health technologies or medicines, and the dynamics of this entity, which is abstract, of course, it does not exist formally, but they are the tail that wags the dog, as we said.
Esses caminhos, quais são? Não é? Primeiro, os preços abusivos de medicamentos.
And these pathways, what are they? Firstly, abusive prices of drugs. We have heard recent news in the US of a small pharmaceutical company, a small laboratory that purchased another one that used to manufacture medications for toxoplasmosis called Daraprim. At least that's the name in the Brazilian market. And it was a medicine that used to be a commodity, and they increased the price to $750. And of course, he was heavily criticized. But of course, new drugs for hepatitis C, which are major technological achievements, and that cannot be argued. That's a hope for millions of people with hepatitis C. It was launched in the United States by Gilland, the $1,000 pill. It's $85,000 over 12 weeks of treatment. And there was this major global protest against that, and the prices are dropping. But generally speaking, drug prices are increasing. And that happens all over the world. And here we see two examples in the US. Those are 6 drugs between 2007 and 2014. Important drugs for narcolepsy, diabetes, allergic reactions, Viagra, which increased by 159%. Drugs for multiple sclerosis, Gleevec, which is manufactured in Brazil, but Gleevec was released in 1990 in Brazil for 300 patients from the public health system. In 2008, it was being given to 3,000 patients with chronic myeloid leukemia, which is its main indication, and the price was rigorously the same. And then Brazil threatened with the mandatory licensing, and the prices dropped. And in parallel to that, the generic drugs started being manufactured because the patent had been canceled. And at the bottom, in the abscess, you see the time or the year when the FDA approved the drug, and in the vertical axis you see the monthly cost of treatment price. With more recent launches, the launch price has been increasing. The second important aspect about what I'm saying are the monopolies and oligopolies, the intellectual property policies. And here I cannot fail to speak about the bilateral and multilateral agreements, trade agreements, especially the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was signed by Canada. It was not signed by Brazil, and hopefully it will not sign it. These bilateral agreements in South America, many countries signed it. All of these agreements to larger or lesser extent, they have a chapter that deals with intellectual property. And these laws related to intellectual property that exist in the bilateral and multilateral trade agreements are all what we call the TRIPS Plus. Concerning the classical practice of intellectual property with the Convention of Paris in 1994, with the creation of the World Trade Organization, there was an international agreement that was called TRIPS. All of the bilateral and regional agreements have IP aspects that go above and beyond the TRIPS. The more intellectual property, the more difficult access is, because the monopoly, even if it's temporary, it will increase prices. It will prevent generic drugs from being released in the market. Therefore, it seems that there's nothing there. There's no lack of supply with the incorporation of technologies, but there is. The third aspect that is a strategy of Big Pharma is the selection of prediction and technological niches as market strategies. Antibiotics, for instance, are disappearing from the world. This graph shows over time the number of antibiotics registered and approved by the FDA. In Brazil, we're seeing a lack of benzathine penicillin, which is absolutely ridiculous. Not having a benzathine penicillin, which is extremely important for syphilis programs and other programs that still exist in Brazil, children that are born with congenital syphilis, because it's a commodity. It's too cheap. And especially because it's not used continually and it's too cheap, multinational companies and the big pharma have given up on manufacturing it. And in Brazil, that closed down the 5 or 6 antibiotic plants that it used to have 30 years ago. It no longer manufactures it. But there are other cases of lack of drugs due to price. The continuous use is something very complicated. Lack of supply and incorporation of technologies, what are the real reasons behind it? The acute lack of supply. There are natural disasters, political, social disasters, evidently a tsunami, something like that will lead to lack of supply. And another thing related to that is access. The medicine exists, it's in the market, but it will not reach people. This lack of supply is due to mistaken social, political decisions, such as, for instance, in Africa and in Brazil, where there's a serious problem related to the health of indigenous peoples in Brazil. And partially you can say that it's because they live too far away in the Amazon, but anyway, you need political alternatives to overcome this logistical problem, don't you? Wars lead to lack of supply as well. During the War of the Falklands, Americans stopped exporting drugs to Argentina. They made an agreement with the British, and they no longer sent medications to Argentina. And it was some other countries from here, from South America, that helped the Argentinians. For instance, one of them was insulin. If you don't use it, if you have to use it and you don't, you start dying because of lack of it. But nor are the political approaches, in my opinion, to mitigate lack of supply. Fighting against the technological imperative, Alicia gave an example of political structures and administrative and technical structures that are able to combat not the technologies but the technological imperatives, which is something different. Secondly, there are policies that are consistent in the assessment and incorporation of technologies. I think Flavio participated in that process, which is the law 12,401, which set forth the criteria of integrality and the public health system of Brazil. Thirdly, the fight against the TRIPS Plus rules in the field of intellectual property and the use of the flexibilities of TRIPS and the free trade, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Not all of them. In the agreement that Chile has with the U.S., there is no such clause, but there are some clauses that state that there won't be compulsory licensing. And there is this imposition in the area of intellectual property. Another important aspect is the understanding that industrial policies of each country must be a component of the health policy. And that's something that was hard to learn in Brazil. The Ministry of Health never cared for industrial policies. Even when it comes to health-related industrial products. However, in the last decade or so, the Ministry of Health of Brazil started dealing with that subject, and now there are policies within the Ministry of Health to interact in order to adapt the industrial policies applied to health, adapt them to the needs of the health sector. Another one is the strengthening of the multilateral architecture. And just like the states are under attack, the multilateral architecture is also under attack. The budget of the WHO, currently no more than 20% of that budget stems from mandatory contributions. Over 80% comes from donations. Most of them earmarked donations. And from a political perspective, the strengthening of this multilateral architecture is very important. And finally, the strengthening of the cooperation and solidarity actions between nations, especially in South America, the South cooperation, and that's what I had.